This is going to be a little home decor video, exciting. For our frame, we did cut our pieces using a CNC machine. Now I know that this is not an accessible tool for most people, so I did include an alternative build plan, which is at the end of the video, that can be achieved with some simple hand and power tools, such as a jigsaw, a hammer, and some nails. But for now, you can just enjoy some very satisfying CNC footage. We're making 2 seats, so we have a top circle and a bottom circle for each of those, which is why there's 4 total. After cutting the dadoed circles on the CNC, we used the scraps from this MDO sheet and cut our vertical supports, making sure that they were the height and width that we needed. We secured our supports to the bases with some brad nails and a pneumatic brad nailer, but a hammer and nails would work just fine. And then the next step is to wrap our bendy ply around the frame, securing with nails along the vertical supports. Our design does feature a rabbet around the top and bottom edge of the circle, which houses the bendy ply, but a simplified design possibility is just to align the bendy ply flush with the top and bottom, making sure that the vertical supports bump all the way out to the edge of the circle. We included a circle in the middle of the bottom base in an attempt to give some more airflow to the frame as a whole. This is more important if you're not using a woven or felted material such as leather, where there is less breathability and air can easily get trapped. Moving on to the upholstery, I found some high density furniture foam. This is 3 inches thick from Joann's. They sold a pack of 2 for a relatively low price, and we were able to get it on sale, which is great. But I'm basically cutting a circle out of the foam at the exact diameter of my frame, which is 21 inches. And then I'm cutting around with just a serrated carving knife from our kitchen. And then ultimately we're going to want to glue the foam to the top of the frame. But first I wanted to make sure that I had the center of the frame marked exactly. So my foam is currently sitting on top of our wooden frame, and I'm using this nail to mark the center of the frame, double checking of course that it actually is center, and that way we have something to align the foam to when we are ready to glue it. I'm just widening it a bit so that the nail fits nicely into the center reference point. To glue the foam to the frame, I'm using a general 3M spray adhesive. Definitely use proper PPE and do this in a well-ventilated area, but I'm using a generous dose on both the foam and the frame, and then waiting a few minutes for it to get tacky. I would just follow the instructions on your adhesive you choose to use. And then I, of course, removed the nail from the center and let it dry. The next step is going to be cutting batting to wrap around the outside of the frame to give it a softer feel. I used a high loft quilt batting and cut strips the length of my circumference, giving myself a little bit extra in height. And then I just wrapped it around the outside and secured the two edges together with some simple slip stitches. I used some all-purpose polyester sewing thread to do this and used 4 strands of thread to give it some bulk. Then I wrapped my second piece around and repeated the same slip stitches down the side. With the extra height in my batting, I'm using that to create a cleaner transition between the foam and the batting, so I'm folding it over and securing it down with these stitches as I'm showing you here. And I'm working my way between each quadrant first and then filling in the spaces in between. I do recommend using an upholstery needle or sailmaker's needle, which is what I'm using, since it can be quite tricky to puncture all the way through the high density foam. Now moving on to the sewing portion, we're starting with a slip cover, which I recycled an old bed sheet to make. You can use muslin or any other light to medium weight woven fabric you have. I utilized the sheet's existing hem, but you'll want to add allowance for hem if you are not doing the same thing. And this side piece is intentionally tapered. This gives it extra space towards the bottom, which makes it easier to pull over the batting without making the batting shift around in place. I recommend measuring your circumference after each step. So after I added batting, I measured my circumference again to double check my length of that piece and then calculated my diameter from my circumference. You'll want to give an extra few inches in height to your side piece so that you can pull it underneath and staple it down securely. The best way to cut a circle, in my opinion, and the most symmetrical way, is to cut a square and then fold into quadrants, and then you'll be able to measure and cut one quadrant and have it be symmetrical all the way around. Next, I'm pinning and sewing the short sides of my trapezoidal side piece together, right sides together, and sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance with a straight stitch. And this will form a cylinder shape that fits the outside of our frame. After my cylinder is sewn together, I'm attaching my circle with pins and sewing that at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can see it's important to have a couple extra inches in height so that it can be pulled and wrapped over to the bottom edge and then stapled down in place. Here I'm just using a staple gun. You can get these for like $10 at Home Depot. They're super affordable, and it worked really well for this upholstery project. I worked my way to each quadrant as I had with the batting and then kind of filled in the spaces from there. And then of course, if you need to remove a staple to adjust, you can use a screwdriver. It works really well, and then just re-staple the piece to the base. And moving on to our final finished seat cover, I had a few extra pattern pieces. You will notice I used some piping for the top and bottom edges. That's optional, but that will match the circumference length of our side piece. And the bottom piping piece is a little bit wider so that we have that extra material at the bottom to staple it down. I'm cutting out my circle the same way as I had with my slipcover, cutting a square and then folding into a quadrant. And I'm using felt as my final cover fabric because it is very affordable. I also had a bunch of extra scrap from an old project, and it's non-woven, so it won't fray and does not need to be hemmed. I'm using 1/4 inch piping, and I want my top piping to have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is what I was calculating here. My top piping strip ended up being about 2 inches total width, so that when it's folded over the piping and sewn down, I have a 1/2 inch extra. And then for my bottom piping, I just added a couple extra inches to that. I think I ended up cutting a 6-inch wide piece. And then of course you'll want to cut your piping down to be the length that you need. And I just like to use a little bit of painter's tape at the end to help stop fraying. You'll want to use a piping foot or a zipper foot so that you can get right up close next to the piping when you're sewing, and I'm just sewing it down with a straight stitch. Repeating the same process for the bottom piping piece as well. I'll leave the link to the tutorial I used to do this down below, but I'm just attaching both ends of my piping to create a piping circle. To add some extra rigidity to the side piece, I am using some medium weight fusible interfacing, and I have it inset a little bit so that it doesn't bulk up the seams. Once that's fused, I'm going to sew right sides together, the side piece at 1/2 inch so it creates a cylinder, and then I pinned my bottom piping, lining up the top edge of the cylinder to 1/2 inch away from the piping, and that'll give me my 1/2 inch seam allowance that I calculated for my cylinder, and leave that extra few inches of bottom piping to be folded underneath the bottom of the seat. And then the top piping has 1/2 inch calculated into it, so I lined it up exactly with the top of the cylinder and sewed it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then flipping my cylinder inside out and pinning my circle right sides together with my top piping sandwiched in between the cylinder and the circle, I pinned it, or in this case I clipped it actually all the way around, and then sewed again with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We liked the look of having ours a little bit elevated off the floor, so we made some little feet out of just some scrap walnut we had and coated them with some Danish oil and then just screwed them to the base of the seat. I attached the final cover just as I had the slip cover. You can see why we needed that extra width from the bottom piping, and stapled it all the way around, and then I had to remove some staples to cut out some space for the feet to be screwed in. That's pretty much all that went into this project, and this is how it turned out.